En la parte 1 de este ejercicio nos enfocaremos en el reconocimiento y en la parte 2 en la recuperación. Puede que encuentres una más fácil de dominar que la otra. Sin embargo, desarrollar estas dos habilidades por igual es fundamental para mejorar tu fluidez. Lo más importante es que logres acostumbrarte a los patrones y a las diferencias en pronunciación de cada cognado, para que finalmente los puedas incorporar correctamente en tu vocabulario al hablar en inglés. So let's begin. Part 1. Escucharás una palabra dicha por un hablante nativo.
Classify.
Una vez la reconozcas, debes decir la ubicación de la imagen correspondiente a esta. On the left. Luego podrás escuchar la respuesta y pronunciación correcta.
On the left.
Tendrás 4 opciones de posicionamiento.
On the top. On the bottom. On the right. On the left.
Para tener en cuenta: top, superior, y bottom, inferior, son ubicaciones. Up, arriba, y down, abajo, son direcciones. Right, derecha, y left, izquierda, se usan en ambos casos ubicación y dirección. Estos puntos debes ubicarlos en la pantalla de tu computador, lo cual es una superficie. En inglés, para referirnos a superficies, debemos usar la preposición on. Por lo tanto, la respuesta sería on the, más la ubicación correcta. Recuerda responder alto y claro antes de que la respuesta correcta sea dada.
Adjust. On the left. Operate. On the top. Sustain. On the right. Adopt. On the right. Integrate. On the bottom. Classify. On the left. Participate. On the top. Evaluate. On the top. Cooperate. On the left. Transform. On the left. Form. On the bottom. Decorate. On the right. Exaggerate. On the bottom. Eliminate. On the left. Insert. On the right. Investigate. On the left. Announce. On the top. Communicate. On the top. Explain. On the left. Locate. On the right. Examine. On the left. Accept. On the bottom. Cooperate. on the bottom. Transform, on the right. Capture, on the top. Integrate, on the right. Plan, on the bottom. Analyze, on the bottom. Motivate, on the left. Operate, on the bottom. Locate, on the left. Adjust, on the right. Form, on the bottom. Participate, on the right. Evaluate, on the top. Eliminate, on the left. Adjust, on the bottom. Calm, on the top. Insert, on the bottom. Classify, on the right. Sustain, on the left. Decorate, on the top. Announce, on the right. Exaggerate, on the left. Accept, on the right. Investigate, on the bottom. Explain, on the right. Motivate, on the bottom. Calm, on the top. Capture, on the left. Adopt, on the bottom. Announce, on the left. Capture, on the bottom. Transform, on the top. Integrate, on the top. Examine, on the bottom. Participate, on the right. Eliminate, on the top. Decorate, on the left. Communicate, on the left. Analyze, on the bottom. Plan, on the right. Explain, on the bottom. Insert, on the right. Investigate, on the bottom. Sustain, On the right. Locate. On the left. Form. On the top. Adopt. On the left. Exaggerate. On the bottom. Calm. On the bottom. Classify. On the top. Evaluate. On the right. Decorate. On the bottom. Examine. On the top. Cooperate. On the top. Motivate. On the left. Operate. On the bottom. Accept. On the top. Participate. On the bottom. Analyze. On the right. Announce. On the top. Capture. On the right. Communicate. On the left. Adjust. On the bottom. Eliminate. On the top. Form. On the bottom. Plan. On the top. Explain. On the bottom. Motivate. On the top. Investigate. On the right. Exaggerate. On the left. Examine. On the bottom. Transform. On the right. Sustain. On the bottom. Analyze. On the left. Insert. On the bottom. Capture. On the left. Operate. On the right. Classify. On the right. Accept. On the bottom. Calm. On the top. Evaluate. On the left. Cooperate. On the bottom. Integrate. On the right. Adopt. On the bottom. Communicate. On the left. Locate. On the right. Plan. On the bottom. Adjust. On the top.
Part 2. Ahora cambiaremos la dinámica. Escucharás primero la ubicación.
Classify.
Una vez hayas reconocido y recordado el cognado correspondiente a la imagen, debes decirlo en voz alta y clara. On the left.
On the left. Investigate. On the right. Locate. On the bottom. Accept. On the left. Eliminate. On the top. Calm. On the right. Classify. On the left. Exaggerate. On the bottom. Examine. On the left. Communicate. On the right. Plan. On the right. Insert. On the bottom. Operate. On the bottom. Participate. On the left. Communicate. On the top. Eliminate. On the right. Classify. On the top. Calm. On the bottom. Cooperate. On the right. Locate. On the left. Cooperate. On the bottom. Exaggerate. On the right. Insert. On the top. Announce. On the left. Locate. On the bottom. Form. On the bottom. Adjust. On the bottom. Insert. On the bottom. Capture. On the top. Integrate. On the right. Participate. On the bottom. Analyze. On the right. Evaluate. On the left. Motivate. On the top. Accept. On the right. Analyze. On the bottom. Sustain. On the bottom. Insert. On the bottom. Accept. On the left. Evaluate. On the top. Communicate. On the right. Integrate. On the right. Participate. On the top. Decorate. On the top. Announce. On the top. Motivate. On the left. Capture. On the bottom. Adopt. On the top. Evaluate. On the right. Announce. On the bottom. Adopt. On the left. Decorate. On the right. Operate. On the left. Communicate. On the right. Adopt. On the left. Classify. On the top. Evaluate. On the right. Decorate. On the right. Transform. On the bottom. Analyze. On the bottom. Operate. On the right. Adjust. On the bottom. Investigate. On the bottom. Motivate. On the left. Announce. On the top. Transform. On the top. Form. On the bottom. Exaggerate. On the top. Classify. On the top. Cooperate. On the top. Plan. On the left. Exaggerate. On the right. Transform. On the left. Analyze. On the top. Adjust. On the left. Adjust. On the bottom. Integrate. On the top. Participate. On the left. Examine. On the bottom. Cooperate. On the top. capture. On the left, motivate. On the left, sustain. On the right, accept. On the right, explain. On the top, calm. On the bottom, explain. On the bottom, investigate. On the left, adopt. On the bottom, calm. On the bottom, adjust. On the bottom, form. On the bottom, explain. On the bottom, examine. On the right, integrate. On the bottom, plan. On the top, operate. On the left, capture. On the top, eliminate. On the right, sustain. On the bottom, decorate. On the right, sustain. On the bottom, form. On the left, explain. On the bottom, plan. On the left, locate. On the top, examine. On the right, capture. On the right, investigate.